Between the flowing waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, where the morning mist rises from fertile banks and settles like a whispered prayer across the endless plains, there emerged something entirely new beneath the vast dome of an ancient sky. Here, in this cradle of rivers that would one day be called Mesopotamia, the very first stirrings of human civilization began to take root in soil made rich by countless seasons of flooding, countless cycles of renewal that had carved the landscape into something both eternal and ever-changing. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, a tapestry of marshlands and fertile plains where wild grasses swayed in rhythms as old as time itself. Reed beds whispered secrets to the wind, their tall stalks bending and straightening in endless conversations that spoke of mysteries beyond human understanding. The air carried the scent of river water and growing things, of earth turned fertile by the patient work of seasons, and somewhere in that primordial atmosphere, consciousness itself was awakening to possibilities that had never before existed in the long story of the world. In the beginning, there were only the waters and the sky, the endless horizon where earth met heaven in a line so perfect it seemed drawn by divine hands. The rivers flowed as they had always flowed, carrying life-giving silt from distant mountains, depositing the very substance of creation across the waiting plains. Each flood season brought renewal. Each recession left behind the promise of abundance. And in this eternal cycle of giving and receiving, something profound was stirring in the depths of human awareness. The earliest settlements appeared like islands in this sea of possibility, small clusters of reed huts and mud-brick dwellings, where people gathered around fires that flickered against the encroaching darkness. These were the first temples of human community, places where stories were born and passed from one generation to the next, where the mysterious workings of the world began to take shape in the human imagination. The settlers watched the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, observed the phases of the moon as it waxed and waned in endless repetition, and felt in their very bones that forces greater than themselves were at work in the world around them. As the centuries passed like slow rivers flowing toward distant seas, these scattered settlements grew into something more substantial, more enduring. The art of agriculture took root in soil that had been waiting since the dawn of time for human hands to unlock its potential. Barley and wheat pushed up through the earth in neat rows that spoke of planning and foresight, of a species learning to work with the rhythms of nature rather than simply surviving within them. The domestication of animals brought cattle and sheep into the growing circle of human influence, their presence adding new layers of complexity to communities that were becoming something the world had never before witnessed. With abundance came leisure, and with leisure came contemplation. The farmer who had finished his work in the fields could sit beneath the evening sky and wonder at the forces that made his crops grow, that brought the rains in their season, and held back the floods until the time was right. The shepherd watching his flocks could feel the presence of something vast and unknowable moving through the world. Something that guided the migrations of birds and the flowering of plants and the very beating of his own heart. These early stirrings of religious consciousness did not emerge suddenly like lightning splitting the darkness, but rather grew slowly and naturally like the crops in their carefully tended fields. The recognition of divine forces began as a feeling, a sense that the world was filled with intentions and purposes beyond human comprehension. Every natural phenomenon carried within it the suggestion of personality, of will, of consciousness, operating on scales that dwarfed human understanding. The wind that brought cooling relief from the summer heat was not merely air in motion, but the breath of something alive and aware. The river that brought life to the fields was not simply water flowing downhill, but a living entity with moods and desires, and the power to give or withhold the gift of existence itself. This emerging awareness of the divine was as practical as it was mystical, rooted in the daily realities of agricultural life, yet reaching toward mysteries that stretched beyond the visible world. The farmer who planted his seeds in spring was engaging in an act of faith that required cooperation with forces beyond his control. He could prepare the soil and plant at the proper time, but the success of his harvest depended on the beneficence of powers that remained largely invisible and utterly essential. Prayer became as natural as breathing, a way of acknowledging the partnership between human effort and divine grace that made civilization possible. The gods emerged from this consciousness not as abstract philosophical concepts, but as vivid personalities whose characteristics reflected the natural forces they embodied. Enlil, lord of the wind and storm, carried within his divine nature both the life-giving breath that made existence possible and the destructive power of hurricanes that could level entire cities. Enki, master of fresh water and wisdom, embodied both the practical knowledge needed for survival and the deeper mysteries of creation itself. Inanna, goddess of love and war, represented the passionate intensity that drove both procreation and conflict, the fierce energy that could build kingdoms and tear them down with equal fervor. These deities were not distant, untouchable beings dwelling in some far-off realm beyond human concern, but rather intimate participants in daily life whose influence could be felt in every aspect of existence. They were present in the morning mist that rose from the rivers, in the evening stars that guided travelers, in the seasonal cycles that governed planting and harvest, in the human emotions that drove love and ambition and the endless quest for meaning. The relationship between humans and gods was one of mutual dependence, a cosmic partnership in which divine favor was essential for human prosperity, while human worship and sacrifice sustained the gods themselves. The development of writing systems emerged from this religious consciousness as naturally as rivers flow toward the sea. The earliest cuneiform tablets were not literature or philosophy in any modern sense, but practical records of temple offerings and divine communications, ways of preserving and transmitting the sacred knowledge that had accumulated over generations of careful observation and spiritual practice. Each wedge-shaped mark pressed into wet clay was a small act of creation, a way of capturing ephemeral thoughts and making them permanent, of building bridges between the human and divine realms. In the great temple complexes that rose like artificial mountains from the flat plains, this emerging religious consciousness found its most magnificent expression. The ziggurats stretched toward heaven in stepped terraces that seemed to invite the gods to descend from their celestial realm and dwell among their human worshippers. Each level represented a different sphere of existence, a different aspect of the cosmic order that connected earth to sky in an ascending spiral of sacred geometry. At the very summit, in chambers accessible only to the highest priests and priestesses, the most intimate communions between human and divine consciousness took place. The daily rhythms of temple life reflected the cosmic rhythms that governed all existence. Dawn brought offerings of bread and beer, incense that carried human prayers upward on fragrant smoke, songs that filled the sacred spaces with harmonies that seemed to echo the music of the spheres themselves. As the sun reached its zenith, the gods were bathed and clothed in garments worthy of their divine status, fed with the finest foods the community could provide, entertained with music and dance that celebrated their power and beauty. Evening brought quieter devotions, intimate conversations between priests and deities that continued long into the night beneath the eternal stars. This was the world that gave birth to the first great hero of human literature, Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose story would echo through the centuries as a testament to the profound relationship between mortal and immortal realms. In the consciousness that created him, gods and humans shared the same stage, pursuing parallel dramas of love and loss, triumph and tragedy, in a cosmos where divine favor could transform a mortal king into a legend, and where even the mightiest heroes remained subject to the ultimate authority of forces beyond their control. The emergence of this divine consciousness in ancient Mesopotamia represented nothing less than a fundamental transformation in human awareness, the birth of religious feeling as a permanent feature of human experience. What began as practical acknowledgement of humanity's dependence on natural forces evolved into sophisticated theologies that would influence spiritual development throughout the ancient world and continue to shape human consciousness millennia later. In the beginning, before the first temple rose from the alluvial plains between the rivers, Before the first cuneiform wedge pressed into wet clay, there existed only the vast and endless waters of primordial chaos. These were not the gentle currents that would later nurture barley and date palms, but something far more ancient and profound. The original substance from which all existence would eventually spring. The Mesopotamians understood that creation did not emerge from nothingness, but from something infinitely more mysterious, the formless, boundless ocean of potential that preceded all form, all boundary, all distinction between earth and sky. At the heart of this watery void dwelt two primordial beings, whose very names carried the weight of cosmic significance. Tiamat, the salt water, embodied the fierce and untamable essence of the sea, that vast expanse of bitter brine that stretched beyond all horizons, holding within its depths both the promise of life and the threat of dissolution. Her waters were ancient beyond measure, carrying within their salt-heavy currents the memory of storms that had raged before time itself began to flow in measurable cycles. Beside her moved Apsu, the fresh water, sweet and life-giving, representing the underground streams and springs that would one day bubble up through the earth to nourish the first gardens of civilization. These two primordial waters were not merely geographic features or natural phenomena, but living entities possessed of consciousness, will, and the power to generate existence itself. When their waters mingled in the cosmic deep, something extraordinary began to unfold, a process of creation that would echo through every subsequent myth and religious understanding that emerged from the Fertile Crescent. The meeting of salt and fresh, of bitter and sweet, of chaos and order, created the fundamental tension from which all life would spring. From this primordial union, the first generation of gods began to emerge, not through deliberate creation, but through the natural overflow of divine essence when opposing forces found their perfect balance. Lamu and Lahamu materialized from the mingled waters, their forms still bearing the fluid characteristics of their aquatic origins, yet possessing enough definition to mark the first step away from pure chaos toward recognizable divine personality. These earliest deities retained much of the formless quality of their parents, appearing sometimes as serpentine creatures wreathed in water and mist, sometimes as barely perceptible currents of consciousness moving through the cosmic deep. As generation followed generation in the divine realm, each new emergence brought greater definition, greater separation from the original unity of the waters. Anshar and Kishar arose as the horizons themselves, the circular boundaries that would eventually define sky and earth, giving shape and limit to what had previously been limitless. Their very existence represented a kind of cosmic rebellion against the formless nature of their ancestors, introducing the revolutionary concept of boundary and definition into a universe that had known only endless flow. The waters of Tiamat grew restless as these newer gods established their domains, their increasing order and definition creating disturbances in the ancient patterns of chaos. What had once been a realm of perfect, undifferentiated potential began to experience the tensions that come with multiplicity, with the assertion of individual will and desire. The younger gods, drunk on their newfound powers of creation and definition, began to shape realms and establish hierarchies, their activities sending ripples of change through the cosmic waters that had remained unchanged since the very beginning. Apsu, the sweet water, found himself increasingly disturbed by the noise and commotion of his divine descendants. The ancient peace of the primordial realm, where consciousness had flowed as smoothly and silently as underground streams, now echoed with the sounds of cosmic construction, with the clashing of divine wills and the grinding of celestial machinery. Where once there had been only the gentle lapping of endless waters against invisible shores, now there arose the hammering of creation, the birth cries of new realms, the assertive voices of gods claiming dominion over aspects of existence that had previously belonged to no one and everyone. Yet Tiamat, the salt water, remained more patient with her unruly offspring. Perhaps because her nature was more fundamentally chaotic, more accepting of turbulence and change. The bitter waters that comprised her essence had always known storm and upheaval, had always danced between creation and destruction in endless cycles that predated the very concept of linear time. Her depths had witnessed the birth and death of countless possibilities, each wave carrying within it the seeds of transformation, each current flowing toward destinations that existed only in potential until the moment of their realization. As the divine generations multiplied and grew ever more distinct from their watery origins, the cosmos itself began to take on a structure that would have been unrecognizable to the primordial waters from which it emerged. The younger gods, led by the increasingly powerful Anu, who claimed dominion over the heavens, began to establish the fundamental patterns that would govern all subsequent existence. They divided the cosmos into recognizable realms, assigned specific functions to different aspects of divinity, and most significantly, began to impose the kinds of order and predictability that were antithetical to the fluid nature of primordial chaos. The emergence of these structured divine hierarchies represented both the culmination of the creative process that had begun with the mingling of Tiamat and Apsu, and the first stirrings of the great cosmic conflict that would eventually reshape the entire universe. Each new level of divine organization created corresponding levels of resistance from the more ancient forces, setting up the tensions that would drive the great mythic cycles of creation and destruction that lay ahead. In the depths of the primordial waters, ancient memories stirred like sediment disturbed by passing currents. Tiamat's vast consciousness began to contemplate the changes that her offspring had wrought, weighing the gains in cosmic order against the losses in primordial freedom. The sweet synchronicity that had once existed between salt and fresh water was giving way to something more complex and potentially more dangerous, a universe where individual will could challenge the fundamental patterns of existence itself, where the descendants of chaos could choose order over their own origins. The stage was being set for conflicts that would echo through every subsequent age, as the forces of primordial chaos prepared to reckon with the increasingly assertive powers of organized divinity. In the cosmic deep, where Tiamat's waters still flowed according to patterns older than time, new currents began to stir, carrying with them the potential for transformation on a scale that would make the previous ages of divine emergence seem like mere ripples on the surface of an ocean whose depths remained largely unexplored and infinitely mysterious. From these primordial waters emerged a cosmic order that would forever define the relationship between heaven and earth, and at its center stood Enlil, whose very breath would shape the destiny of gods and mortals alike. Born from the union of Anu, the Sky Father, and Ki, the Earth Mother, Enlil inherited dominion over the space between these two fundamental realms, the atmospheric sphere where winds dance and storms are born, where the breath of life itself moves through all creation. The ancient Mesopotamians understood Enlil not merely as a god of weather, but as the very principle of divine authority made manifest in the natural world. His name, which scholars translate as Lord Wind, or Lord of the Hurricane, carried within it the essence of power that could both nurture and destroy. When the morning breeze carried the scent of barley across the fertile plains, that was Enlil's gentle caress. When the violent storms of spring brought torrential rains that could flood entire cities, that too was Enlil, displaying the awesome scope of his dominion. The Sumerians and their successors saw in every gust of wind, every change in atmospheric pressure, every shift in the weather patterns that governed their agricultural cycles, the direct intervention of this mighty deity whose moods could mean the difference between abundance and famine. Within the carefully structured hierarchy of Mesopotamian divinity, Enlil occupied a position of supreme executive authority. While Anu remained the distant sovereign of the heavens, removed from the daily affairs of creation, and while Ea dwelt in the depths of the freshwater ocean, managing the mysterious arts of wisdom and magic, Enlil ruled the middle realm where divine will translated into earthly reality. The ancient texts describe him as the keeper of the tablets of destiny, those mystical stone tablets upon which the fates of gods and humans were inscribed in cuneiform script that glowed with supernatural fire. These tablets represented more than mere records. They were the very mechanisms through which cosmic law operated, the source code of reality itself. The city of Nippur, situated in the heart of ancient Sumer, served as Enlil's earthly dwelling place, and its great ziggurat rose toward the heavens like a mountain made by human hands. Within the innermost sanctuary of his temple, the Eka, literally mountain house, priests maintained the eternal fires and performed the daily rituals that kept the cosmic order in balance. The temple complex bustled with constant activity as offerings arrived from across Mesopotamia, for Enlil's favor was essential to any earthly endeavor. Kings traveled hundreds of miles to prostrate themselves before his altar, seeking legitimacy for their rule. Farmers brought the first fruits of their harvest, acknowledging that their prosperity flowed from his beneficence. Merchants sought his blessing before embarking on dangerous trading expeditions across the desert routes that connected the civilized world. The divine assembly over which Enlil presided functioned as a celestial mirror of earthly political structures, yet operated on principles that transcended human understanding. When the gods gathered in the Great Hall of Heaven to debate matters of cosmic importance, Enlil's voice carried the weight of final authority. The lesser deities, the Ijiji who served in heaven, and the Anunnaki who walked among mortals, all acknowledged his supremacy in matters of practical governance. His decisions rippled outward through the fabric of reality, manifesting as natural phenomena, historical events, and the subtle currents of fate that guided individual lives toward their appointed destinies. This divine hierarchy reflected the Mesopotamian understanding that order emerged from chaos through the establishment of clear relationships and responsibilities. Just as earthly society required kings, nobles, priests, and common citizens each fulfilling their proper roles, so too did the cosmic realm function through a carefully maintained structure of divine authority. Enlil's position as executor of divine will meant that he served as the primary intermediary between the realm of pure spiritual power and the material world where humans struggled to survive and prosper. The myths surrounding Enlil reveal a complex deity whose character encompassed both creative and destructive aspects of natural power. In some stories, he appears as the wise ruler who establishes the foundations of civilization, teaching humans the arts of agriculture, urban planning, and religious worship. These tales describe how he breathed life into the first cities, inspiring their builders to create the technological marvels that distinguished Mesopotamian culture from the primitive societies surrounding it. The invention of writing, the development of mathematical systems, the engineering principles that allowed the construction of massive irrigation networks, all these achievements were attributed to divine inspiration flowing from Enlil's cosmic authority. Yet other myths present Enlil as a force of terrible judgment, particularly in the great flood narratives that predate and parallel the biblical story of Noah. In these ancient accounts, Enlil grows weary of humanity's noise and disorder, their failure to properly honor the gods, their tendency toward violence and corruption. His decision to unleash the deluge represents not merely divine anger, but cosmic necessity, the periodic cleansing that prevents chaos from overwhelming order. The flood stories reveal the Mesopotamian understanding that destruction and creation were not opposites, but complementary aspects of a larger cosmic cycle, with Enlil serving as the divine agent who maintained this eternal rhythm. The theological implications of Enlil's role extended far beyond weather control or political authority. Ancient Mesopotamian priests developed sophisticated doctrines around his nature that influenced religious thought throughout the ancient Near East. They understood him as the embodiment of divine logos, the rational principle that transforms pure spiritual energy into ordered creation. Through his breath, the formless void acquired structure and meaning. Through his words, spoken in the celestial assembly, abstract divine will became concrete historical reality. This cosmic function manifested in the elaborate ritual cycles that marked the Mesopotamian religious calendar. During the spring festivals, priests would reenact the primordial moment when Enlil first separated heaven from earth, symbolically renewing the cosmic order for another year. These ceremonies involved complex, choreographed movements, carefully timed musical performances, and the recitation of ancient hymns, whose rhythmic patterns were believed to harmonize earthly worship with celestial harmony. The faithful who participated in these rituals understood themselves to be collaborating with Enlil in the ongoing work of maintaining universal order against the constant pressure of chaotic forces. The influence of Enlil worship spread far beyond the boundaries of Mesopotamia proper, carried by traders, diplomats, and conquering armies throughout the ancient world. Temples dedicated to him arose in distant cities, adapted to local conditions, but preserving the essential elements of his cult. Foreign peoples incorporated him into their own pantheons, sometimes identifying him with their indigenous sky gods, sometimes recognizing him as a distinct divine presence whose power demanded acknowledgement. This religious diffusion created a network of sacred sites connected by shared theological understanding, an ancient ecumenical community united in recognition of Enlil's cosmic authority. The architectural legacy of Enlil worship produced some of the most impressive monuments of the ancient world. The ziggurats built in his honor represented more than mere temples. They were cosmic mountains, artificial peaks that bridged the gap between earth and heaven. Their stepped construction mimicked the layered structure of the divine realm, with each level corresponding to a different aspect of celestial hierarchy. Pilgrims climbing these sacred stairs experienced a physical journey that paralleled their spiritual ascent toward divine communion, feeling with each step the increasing proximity to Enlil's overwhelming presence. The divine winds that carried Enlil's commands across the Fertile Crescent would soon witness a descent that would shake the very foundations of existence itself. In the pantheon of Mesopotamian deities, none commanded such fierce devotion and trembling reverence as Inanna, the goddess whose beauty blazed like the morning star and whose wrath could wither kingdoms. Known to the Akkadians as Ishtar, she embodied the eternal paradox of creation and destruction, love and war, the fertile earth that gives life, and the barren wasteland that consumes it. Her temples rose like beacons across the ancient world, their walls echoing with hymns that spoke of her unmatched power and terrible majesty. The great myth that has echoed through millennia tells of Inanna's most perilous journey, one that would take her beyond the realm of the living into the dark kingdom of the dead. The reasons for her descent into the underworld have been debated by scholars and storytellers alike, some claiming she sought to extend her dominion over death itself, others suggesting she went to attend the funeral rites of Gugulana, the bull of heaven, her sister's husband. Whatever drove her to make this fateful journey, the goddess adorned herself in her finest regalia, each piece a symbol of her divine authority. The crown of heaven rested upon her brow, turquoise beads cascaded down her neck, twin egg-shaped stones hung at her breast, and a golden ring encircled her finger. Her royal robe flowed around her like liquid starlight, and in her hand she carried the rod and line of justice. The entrance to the underworld stood before her like a wound in the earth, guarded by 7 gates that had never yielded to divine command. Each gate was watched by demons whose eyes burned like coals in the eternal twilight of that realm. Neti, the chief gatekeeper, challenged the goddess at the first threshold, demanding to know why one who ruled the upper world sought passage into the domain of the dead. Inanna's voice rang out clear and commanding, declaring her intention to witness the funeral rites, though darker purposes may have stirred in her immortal heart. The gatekeeper, bound by ancient laws that governed even the gods, could not refuse her passage, but neither could he allow her to enter unchanged. At each successive gate, the inexorable ritual of descent continued, stripping away layer after layer of Inanna's divine power and earthly majesty. The crown of heaven was removed at the first gate, its weight suddenly absent from her noble brow. At the second gate, her necklace of turquoise beads was taken, the cool stones no longer resting against her throat. The twin egg-shaped stones that marked her divine femininity were claimed at the third gate, followed by her golden ring at the fourth. Each removal was performed with ceremonial precision, the gatekeepers speaking in voices like distant thunder as they explained that none could enter the realm of death without surrendering the symbols of life. At the fifth gate, her rod and line of justice were stripped away, leaving her hands empty of the instruments of divine authority. The sixth gate claimed her flowing robe, leaving her form bare to the chill winds that swept through the underworld's corridors. When Inanna finally stood before the seventh and final gate, she had been reduced from the blazing goddess of love and war to a figure as vulnerable as any mortal soul. The last gate opened with a sound like the closing of a tomb, and she entered the throne room of Ereshkigal, her sister and queen of the underworld. The contrast between the two goddesses could not have been more stark. Where Inanna had once blazed with the light of the upper world, Ereshkigal ruled from shadows, her beauty terrible and cold as winter moonlight on bare stone. The queen of the dead sat upon her throne of bones, flanked by the Anunnaki, the 7 judges of the underworld, whose gazes could freeze the blood of gods. The confrontation between the sisters erupted with the fury of a cosmic storm. Words sharp as obsidian blades flew between them, each accusation a thunderbolt that shook the foundations of the underworld. Ereshkigal's rage at her sister's presumption burned like acid, while Inanna's defiance remained unbroken even in her nakedness and vulnerability. The air itself seemed to crackle with divine fury as the two goddesses faced each other across the throne room, their conflict representing the eternal struggle between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The Anunnaki watched in terrible silence, their ancient faces revealing nothing of their thoughts as they witnessed this clash of immortal wills. The judgment, when it came, was swift and merciless. Ereshkigal's voice rang out like a funeral bell, pronouncing the sentence of death upon her sister. At her command, the demons of the underworld fell upon Inanna, their claws rending her divine flesh, while their voices howled like winter winds through desolate valleys. The goddess who had commanded love and war was struck down, her body hanging lifeless from a hook like a piece of meat in a butcher's stall. The light that had blazed within her was extinguished, leaving only darkness where once there had been radiance. Death had claimed even a goddess, and the natural order trembled at the implications of this cosmic transgression. Above in the world of mortals, the absence of Inanna began to manifest in ways both subtle and profound. The fertility that had blessed the earth under her protection slowly ebbed away, leaving fields barren and wombs empty. Lovers found their passion cooling to ash, while soldiers discovered their courage faltering in the face of battle. The very force of life itself seemed to be draining from the world, as if the goddess's death had torn a hole in the fabric of existence through which vitality itself was flowing into the void. Animals ceased to mate, plants withered in the soil, and even the great rivers that had nourished civilization began to slow their ancient flow toward the sea. The other gods, witnessing this cosmic catastrophe, understood that intervention was necessary to prevent the complete collapse of the natural order. Enki, the wise god of fresh water and wisdom, crafted 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, creatures so small and insignificant that they could slip through the 7 gates unnoticed by the guardians of death. These beings, neither male nor female, but something beyond such earthly categories, descended into the underworld, carrying the food and water of life. They found Ereshkigal writhing in the agony of childbirth, her screams echoing through the caverns of the dead as she brought forth new demons to populate her kingdom. The creatures that Enki had made showed compassion for the queen's suffering, offering comfort and understanding rather than fear or judgment. Moved by their unexpected kindness, Ereshkigal granted them a boon, and they requested the corpse of Inanna. The queen of the dead commanded that the body be taken down from its hook and sprinkled with the food and water of life, the mystical substances that could restore vitality even to the gods. As the sacred elements touched her lifeless flesh, Inanna stirred like a flower opening to the dawn. Colour returned to her cheeks, breath filled her lungs, and the divine fire rekindled in her eyes. She rose from death as the morning star rises from the horizon, her beauty undimmed by her journey through the shadow realm. Yet, the laws that govern the underworld were as immutable as the movements of the stars, and Ereshkigal declared that no soul could leave her domain without providing another to take its place. The demons of the underworld followed Inanna as she ascended through the 7 gates, ready to drag back to the depths whoever she might designate as her substitute. As she reclaimed each piece of her divine regalia, her power returned in waves that sent tremors through both the upper and lower worlds. Her crown settled upon her brow like the rising sun. Her necklace gleamed like captured starlight, and her robe flowed around her renewed form like liquid gold. The goddess emerged into the world above, transformed by her encounter with death, carrying within her divine essence the knowledge of both life and its inevitable ending. Her gaze fell upon Dumuzi, her beloved shepherd consort, who had not mourned her passing, but instead had revelled in her absence, adorning himself with fine clothes and celebrating as if her death had brought him freedom rather than sorrow. The sight of his betrayal ignited a fury that burned hotter than the desert sun, and without hesitation, she designated him as her replacement in the underworld. The demons seized Dumuzi with claws like iron, dragging him down into the darkness despite his pleas and protests. Yet even in her wrath, Inanna could not bear to condemn her beloved to eternal torment, and so a compromise was reached that would echo through the cycles of time itself. Dumuzi would spend half the year in the underworld as payment for Inanna's freedom, while his sister Geshtinanna, moved by love for her brother, would take his place for the remaining months. This eternal exchange established the rhythm of the seasons, with Dumuzi's death bringing the barren months of winter and his return heralding the flowering of spring, while the goddess Inanna herself embodied the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that governs all existence. The eternal dance between life and death that Inanna embodied would find its most profound expression in the ancient world's greatest tale of divine retribution and human survival. As the goddess emerged from her journey through the 7 gates of the underworld, forever changed by her encounter with mortality, the stage was set for an even more catastrophic demonstration of divine power. The gods of Mesopotamia, those capricious beings who ruled from their ziggurats of cloud and starlight, were preparing to unleash their most terrible judgment upon the world below. The great deluge that would follow would not merely test the limits of human endurance, but would reshape the very understanding of what it meant to exist in the shadow of divine wrath. In the sprawling city of Shuruppak, where the Euphrates curved like a golden serpent through fields of barley and date palms, there lived a man whose piety would ultimately preserve the essence of all creation. Utnapishtim, whose name whispered of distant life and far-off days, moved through his daily rituals with the measured grace of one who understood the delicate balance between mortal ambition and divine will. The reed walls of his dwelling caught the morning light as he offered incense to Ea, the wise god of fresh waters and hidden knowledge. Little did the inhabitants of this ancient metropolis realize that their world balanced on the edge of an abyss deeper than the darkest regions of Ereshkigal's domain. The divine assembly had convened in their celestial palace, that magnificent structure that existed somewhere between dream and reality, where golden light filtered through walls of lapis lazuli, and the air itself seemed to thrum with otherworldly power. Enlil, the great god of storms and kingship, stood before his fellow deities with eyes that flashed like lightning across summer skies. His voice, when it emerged, carried the weight of thunder rolling across vast plains. Humanity had grown too numerous, too loud, their cities sprawling like infections across the pristine earth. Their festivals rang through the night, their marketplaces buzzed with constant activity, their children's laughter and lovers' songs created an endless cacophony that disturbed the gods' eternal rest. The noise of human civilization had become unbearable to the divine ear, a constant drumbeat that prevented the gods from finding peace in their celestial realm. The decision, when it came, fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of consequence throughout all creation. The great flood would wash the earth clean, returning it to the primordial silence that existed before the first human settlement scratched its mark upon virgin soil. Rivers would reverse their courses, mountains would disappear beneath walls of water that reached toward the very stars themselves. Every breathing creature would perish in the deluge, their voices finally stilled, their cities dissolved into memory and sediment. Only then would the gods find the tranquility they craved, the perfect quiet of an empty world where their thoughts could drift uninterrupted through eternity. Yet among the divine council, one voice spoke in gentle dissent. whose wisdom ran as deep as the underground streams that nourished the earth's hidden roots, felt the stirring of compassion for the mortals below. His connection to humanity ran deeper than mere creation. He had breathed consciousness into clay and watched with paternal pride as civilization bloomed across the river valleys. Through whispered dreams and subtle signs, he began to communicate with his most faithful devotee, Utnapishtim, speaking in riddles and metaphors that would preserve the appearance of divine unity while offering humanity its only hope of survival. The message came to Utnapishtim as he slept, filtering through his consciousness like water through fertile soil. Reed house, the divine voice murmured, wall, wall, listen carefully. The cryptic words contained within them the blueprint for salvation, instructions wrapped in the protective veil of symbolic language. Demolish the house, build a ship, abandon possessions, seek life, despise property, save living beings. Each phrase burned itself into Utnapishtim's memory with the intensity of fire on dry papyrus, leaving him trembling with the weight of divine revelation and the magnitude of the task ahead. Dawn broke over Shuruppak with unusual intensity, the sky taking on shades of amber and deep gold that seemed to pulse with inner light. Utnapishtim rose from his reed mat, with purpose flowing through his veins like liquid bronze. The construction of the ark began that very morning, a project that would consume every moment of the days remaining before the deluge. The vessel he envisioned defied the conventional wisdom of boat building, its design dictated not by the familiar needs of river transport, but by divine specification transmitted through dream and vision. 7 decks would rise within its hull, each compartment carefully planned to accommodate the breeding pairs of every species that walked, crawled, or flew across the face of the earth. The sound of hammering and sawing soon filled the air around Utnapishtim's dwelling, creating its own rhythm that seemed to match the increasingly urgent beating of his heart. Cypress wood fell beneath his axe, each swing guided by the supernatural strength that divine purpose lent to mortal limbs. The aromatic shavings curled away from his adze like prayers made manifest, their resinous scent rising to mingle with the incense that burned constantly before his household shrine. Neighbors gathered to watch this strange construction, their faces mixing curiosity with concern, as the massive vessel took shape far from any navigable water deep enough to float such a craft. Their questions went unanswered, for how could Utnapishtim explain that he built not for earthly seas, but for waters that would fall from heaven itself? As the ark neared completion, its bitumen-sealed hull gleaming like black obsidian in the afternoon sun, the signs of approaching catastrophe began to manifest throughout the natural world. Animals displayed behavior that defied their usual patterns, gathering in unusual numbers around Utnapishtim's property as if drawn by an instinct older than memory. Birds that normally migrated singly arrived in vast flocks, their cries creating a symphony of anticipation that seemed to echo from the very heavens. Domestic creatures abandoned their usual routines, cattle lowing with an urgency that their human owners could not comprehend, dogs howling at a sky that appeared deceptively clear to mortal eyes. The loading of the ark began under cover of darkness, a procession that seemed to emerge from the pages of creation itself. 2 by 2, the animals came forth from field and forest, mountain and marsh, their instincts drawing them toward salvation they could not possibly understand. Lions walked peacefully alongside gazelles, wolves trotted beside lambs, eagles perched next to sparrows in a temporary suspension of nature's eternal hierarchies. Utnapishtim moved among them with the careful attention of a shepherd tending his flock, ensuring that each species found its designated place within the great vessel's many chambers. The air grew thick with the mingled scents of fur and feather, the sounds of countless breathing creatures, creating a living orchestra that would soon be the only chorus left upon earth. The final night before the deluge arrived, wrapped in an ominous stillness that seemed to press against the skin like a physical presence. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns that appeared subtly wrong to those few who possessed the knowledge to read their ancient messages. The very earth seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when heaven's floodgates would open and reshape the world according to divine will. Utnapishtim made his final preparations, with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the overwhelming responsibility that had been placed upon his mortal shoulders. Within the ark's dark interior, thousands of eyes reflected the flickering light of oil lamps, creating a constellation of life that would soon be the only light remaining in a world covered by primordial waters. The great test of faith and endurance was about to begin, a trial that would determine not merely the survival of individual species, but the very continuation of the divine experiment called life upon Earth. The waters receded, leaving behind a world transformed, and in this renewed landscape walked a figure whose very name would echo through millennia like thunder across distant mountains. Gilgamesh emerged from the mists of legend not as a distant deity dwelling in celestial realms, but as something more complex and compelling, a king whose mortal blood pulsed with divine fire, whose human heart wrestled with godlike ambitions. In the great city of Uruk, where the massive walls rose like geometric mountains against the endless sky, this extraordinary being ruled with the fierce intensity of one who contained within himself the eternal struggle between earth and heaven, between the limitations of flesh and the boundless hunger of the spirit. The scribes who carved his story into clay understood that here was no ordinary tale of conquest and glory. In their careful wedge-shaped marks, pressed deep into tablets that would outlast empires, they captured something fundamental about the human condition, the terrible beauty of mortality, wrestling with dreams of permanence. Gilgamesh stood 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a mathematical impossibility that spoke to deeper truths about the nature of heroism and the burden of greatness. His strength could shatter bronze gates like pottery, yet his heart carried the weight of questions that no amount of physical power could answer. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu had been forged in combat and tempered through shared adventure, creating a bond that seemed to transcend the very boundaries of mortal existence. Together, they had ventured into the cedar forests, where ancient giants dwelled, their footsteps echoing through groves so vast that sunlight filtered down in cathedral beams through canopies that had witnessed the birth of civilisations. They had faced Humbaba, the terrible guardian whose voice was like the roar of floodwaters and whose breath carried the essence of death itself. Side by side, they had challenged the gods themselves, striking down the bull of heaven in a display of defiance that shook the very foundations of cosmic order. But even heroes crafted partly from divine essence cannot escape the fundamental laws that govern all living things. When death came for Enkidu, it arrived not in the glorious clash of battle, but through the slow, inexorable process of divine punishment, a fever that burned away strength and vitality like fire consuming parchment. Gilgamesh watched helplessly as his companion, the wild man who had become closer than a brother, gradually faded from vibrant life into stillness. For 7 days and 7 nights, he refused to accept what his eyes witnessed, sitting beside the motionless form, as if sheer force of will could restore breath to silent lungs. The realization of mortality struck Gilgamesh with a force more devastating than any physical blow he had ever received. Standing in his palace halls, where golden artifacts caught the light of oil lamps and reflected back images of permanence and power, he suddenly understood the terrible mathematics of existence. If death could claim Enkidu, brave, strong, beloved Enkidu, then no earthly achievement could provide true security against the approaching darkness. The treasures surrounding him, the monuments bearing his name, the very walls of Uruk itself, all suddenly seemed as fragile as morning frost before the rising sun. Thus began a quest that would transform him from conquering king to desperate wanderer, abandoning the comfortable certainties of throne and crown for the harsh uncertainties of roads that led beyond the edges of known geography. Clad in the skins of lions he had slain, his royal robes left behind like shed snakeskin, Gilgamesh set forth to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood who had been granted the ultimate prize, life without ending. The journey stretched before him like an endless scroll unrolling across landscapes that grew stranger and more perilous with each passing day, as if the very earth reflected his movement away from ordinary human concerns toward mysteries that mortals were never meant to pursue. Through mountain passes, where the wind carved haunting melodies from stone formations, across deserts where the sun blazed with such intensity that it seemed to burn away not just water from the body, but hope from the soul. Gilgamesh pressed forward. He traversed the tunnel through Mount Mashu, where darkness pressed against him like a living thing for 12 double hours of walking, guided only by distant light that seemed as remote as stars, reflected in deep water. The scorpion beings who guarded the entrance had warned him that no mortal had ever passed through their domain, yet something in his bearing, some mixture of divine authority and desperate determination, convinced them to grant passage. Beyond the mountain lay the garden of the gods, where precious stones grew like fruit on crystalline trees, and the very air shimmered with colours that had no names in human language. Here dwelt Siduri, the tavern keeper at the edge of the world, whose wisdom flowed like wine from vessels that never emptied. She observed this dust-covered wanderer with eyes that had witnessed countless ages pass like seasons, recognizing in his hollow gaze the particular madness that overtakes mortals when they first truly comprehend their own impermanence. Her counsel carried the weight of eternal observation of human folly and grandeur. Life, she reminded him, was meant to be lived in its fleeting moments. Bread should be eaten with joy, wine savoured for its temporary warmth, children held close while their laughter still echoed through household rooms. The gods had kept immortality for themselves and given death to mankind, not as punishment, but as the very thing that made each moment precious. Yet even as these words of wisdom settled around him like gentle rain on parched earth, Gilgamesh could not release his grip on the consuming need to transcend the boundaries that confined all other mortals. The ferryman Urshanabi carried him across the waters of death, those dark currents that separated the world of the living from the realm where Utnapishtim dwelled in timeless peace. The journey across those midnight waters felt like crossing between different states of existence, each stroke of the oars taking him further from everything that had once defined his identity as king and hero. When at last he stood before Utnapishtim, the flood survivor seemed neither impressed by royal bearing nor moved by passionate pleas for the secret of eternal life. Utnapishtim's challenge struck at the heart of Gilgamesh's assumptions about his own exceptional nature. If he truly wished to join the ranks of the immortal, let him first prove his mastery over sleep's gentler cousin by remaining awake for 6 days and 7 nights. The test seemed almost insultingly simple to one who had faced monsters and defied gods, yet sleep descended upon him like floodwaters, swift and irresistible. He succumbed almost immediately, his body claiming the rest it had been denied through leagues of desperate travel. When he awoke to find bread left beside him in various stages of staleness, each loaf marking another day of unconsciousness, Gilgamesh finally understood the magnitude of his self-deception. If he could not even conquer sleep, how could he hope to defeat death itself? Yet Utnapishtim's wife, moved by compassion for this fallen king who had journeyed so far in pursuit of impossible dreams, whispered of one last possibility: a plant that grew at the bottom of the sweet water sea, a thorned herb that could restore youth to those brave enough to retrieve it. The dive into those profound depths required releasing even the breath in his lungs, sinking down through layers of water that grew darker and colder with each fathom, until finally his hands closed around the miraculous plant. The thorns bit deep into his palms as he grasped it, as if even this gift demanded payment in blood and pain. Rising back toward the surface, his lungs burning and consciousness fading, Gilgamesh carried with him what seemed to be redemption itself. Not immortality, perhaps, but at least the promise of renewed youth, of time reclaimed from the relentless advance of aging. Yet even this prize would slip away like water through desperate fingers, lost to a serpent's ancient hunger while he bathed in a cool spring. Believing himself finally triumphant, the snake shed its old skin and slithered away renewed, while Gilgamesh was left with nothing but the bitter understanding that some truths cannot be changed, no matter how far one travels or how much one sacrifices in pursuit of transformation. He would return to Uruk empty-handed, but perhaps finally wise, carrying within him the the profound recognition that mortality itself might be the very thing that gave meaning to heroic deeds and noble aspirations. The great king's solitary reign cast long shadows across the ziggurat steppes of Uruk, where the weight of divine blood and mortal flesh created a ruler both magnificent and profoundly alone. Gilgamesh walked the cedar-lined corridors of his palace with the restless energy of one who had conquered cities but could not conquer the emptiness that echoed in the chambers of his heart. The gods, observing from their celestial heights, recognized in this king-hero a dangerous imbalance. Power without companionship, strength without understanding, divinity without the tempering influence of true friendship. In the vast wilderness beyond the city walls, where the rivers meandered through reed beds and the horizon dissolved into shimmering heat, the goddess Aruru shaped with her divine hands a being from the primordial clay of creation. This was Enkidu, formed not in the image of civilized humanity, but as a creature of the wild places, a man whose hair flowed like the manes of lions, whose body bore the strength of the auroch and the grace of the gazelle. His feet had never known the smooth stones of city streets, his eyes had never looked upon the geometric perfection of temple walls, and his heart beat with the ancient rhythms of the untamed earth. Enkidu moved through the grasslands like a force of nature itself, his naked form bronzed by endless suns and hardened by the elemental struggles of survival. The herds of wild animals gathered around him as their protector and brother, sensing in his presence something that spoke to the deepest memories of creation. When the boundaries between human and beast were thin as morning mist, he would run with the gazelles across the rolling plains, his long hair streaming behind him like a banner of freedom, his powerful limbs carrying him across distances that would exhaust the finest horses of Uruk's cavalry. The shepherds who grazed their flocks at the edges of the wilderness spoke in hushed tones of this wild man who sabotaged their traps and freed their snared animals, who filled in the hunting pits they dug with such careful precision. His interference disrupted the delicate balance between civilization and the wild, protecting the creatures of the steppes from the encroachment of human needs and desires. These reports traveled like ripples across still water, eventually reaching the ears of Gilgamesh himself, who listened with growing fascination to tales of this being who seemed to embody everything his own divine nature had left behind. The temple priestess Shamhat was chosen for a task that would bridge the vast chasm between wild and civilized worlds, carrying within her robes not just the sacred oils and perfumes of Ishtar's service, but the transformative power of human connection and desire. She journeyed to the watering holes where Enkidu was known to appear, those ancient gathering places where the animals came to drink, and the earth showed its most generous face. For 6 days and 7 nights, she waited with the patience of one who understood that the greatest changes in the cosmos often began with the smallest gestures of recognition. When Enkidu finally emerged from the tall grasses, his approach to the waterhole carried all the caution of a creature who had learned to read the subtle languages of danger and safety written in the wind and soil. Shamhat revealed herself slowly, her civilized beauty creating ripples of curiosity and longing in the wild man's consciousness, awakening desires he had never experienced, but somehow understood with the deep wisdom of his created nature. Their union lasted 7 days, during which the fundamental essence of Enkidu's being underwent a transformation as profound as the changing of seasons. The animals sensed this change immediately, the gazelles stepping nervously away from their former companion, the lions regarding him with new wariness, the birds taking flight when he approached their roosts. Enkidu felt the severing of those ancient bonds with a grief that ran deeper than tears, recognizing that he had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Shamhat clothed his nakedness with fabric woven in the looms of Uruk, fed him bread baked in clay ovens, offered him beer brewed from barley grown in irrigated fields, each gift drawing him further from his wild origins and closer to the complex world of human civilization. The priestess spoke to him of Gilgamesh, describing the great king's strength and beauty, his magnificent deeds and his terrible loneliness, weaving with her words a tapestry of longing that made Enkidu's newly awakened heart ache with the desire for companionship. She told him of dreams that had visited both the king and his mother Ninsun, prophetic visions of a meteoric star falling from heaven, of an axe of tremendous weight that could not be lifted by any man in Uruk save Gilgamesh himself. Symbols that the dream interpreters had recognized as harbingers of a friend whose strength would match the king's own. Enkidu entered the city of Uruk like a storm cloud gathering on a clear horizon, his presence felt before he was seen. His approach whispered through the marketplace crowds and the temple courts, with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. The great gates of bronze and cedar, decorated with the figures of protective lions and soaring eagles, stood open before him like the entrance to another world entirely. The geometric perfection of the streets, the towering height of the ziggurat, reaching toward the realm of the gods, the intricate irrigation channels that brought life-giving water to every corner of the urban landscape, all of these marvels spoke to Enkidu of human ingenuity and divine ambition made manifest in brick and stone. The first meeting between Gilgamesh and Enkidu erupted with the force of two great rivers converging, their confrontation shaking the foundations of the palace and sending tremors through the ceremonial courtyards where priests had gathered to witness this unprecedented encounter. They grappled with a fury that was both fierce contest and recognition, each testing the other's strength, while discovering in their opponent the mirror of their own power and determination. Door frames splintered under the impact of their wrestling bodies, stone columns cracked from the reverberations of their struggle, and the very earth seemed to groan beneath the weight of their cosmic battle. Yet in the midst of their violent testing came the moment of understanding, when each warrior recognized in the other not an enemy to be defeated, but a brother to be embraced. Their anger transformed into laughter, their hostility melted into mutual respect, and the lonely chambers of both their hearts suddenly filled with the warmth of true companionship. Gilgamesh found in Enkidu the friend who could understand both his divine aspirations and his mortal struggles, while Enkidu discovered in the king a guide who could help him navigate the complexities of civilized existence without completely abandoning his connection to the wild places of his birth. Together, they walked the sacred precincts of Uruk, Gilgamesh showing Enkidu the temples where the gods were honored with offerings of honey and precious oils, the workshops where master craftsmen shaped gold and silver into objects of transcendent beauty, the royal gardens where exotic trees from distant lands grew alongside native palms and tamarisks. Enkidu brought to these familiar surroundings the fresh perspective of one seeing civilization's achievements through eyes that remembered the stark honesty of the wilderness, helping Gilgamesh understand his city not just as a monument to human power, but as a delicate balance maintained between order and chaos. Their friendship became the stuff of legend, even in their own time, two beings of extraordinary nature finding in each other the completion that neither divine blood nor wild freedom could provide alone. In Enkidu, Gilgamesh discovered the grounding influence that tempered his godlike arrogance with genuine humility and compassion. In Gilgamesh, Enkidu found purpose that transformed his raw strength into heroic achievement and his isolation into meaningful connection. The taming of wild nature had occurred not through conquest or subjugation, but through love and understanding, creating a bond that would echo through the corridors of time as one of literature's most profound celebrations of friendship's transformative power. The profound bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu represented more than mere friendship. It embodied the eternal human desire to bridge the vast chasm between mortal existence and divine understanding. As their legendary companionship deepened, the sacred architecture of Mesopotamia stood as silent witness to this same yearning, manifested in stone and brick, reaching toward the heavens. The ziggurats that dominated the landscape of ancient Sumer and Babylon were not merely buildings, but cosmic mountains, earthly representations of the divine realm where gods dwelt in splendor beyond mortal comprehension. These towering structures rose from the fertile plains like artificial mountains, their stepped facades climbing in perfect mathematical progression toward the sky. Each level represented a stage in the celestial hierarchy, a carefully orchestrated ascent from the mundane world of commerce and daily life toward the rarefied atmosphere where divine beings held court. The great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, exemplified this architectural theology with its 3 magnificent terraces, each smaller than the one below, creating a sense of infinite upward movement that seemed to dissolve into the limitless blue of the Mesopotamian sky. Construction of these sacred monuments required not merely human labor, but divine inspiration, with master builders consulting astronomical charts and sacred geometries passed down through generations of temple architects. The bricks themselves were more than mere building materials. Each one was formed from the sacred earth of the river valleys, mixed with water blessed by priests and fired in kilns that burned with flames consecrated to specific deities. Workers chanted hymns as they laid each course, their voices rising and falling in rhythms that matched the eternal cycles of the cosmos, binding human effort to divine purpose in an unbreakable chain of devotion. The base of each ziggurat sprawled across vast courtyards where pilgrims gathered from distant cities, their faces turned upward toward the temple crown that gleamed like a jewel against the desert sky. These courtyards bustled with the controlled energy of religious festivals, where the scent of burning frankincense mingled with the aroma of bread baked for sacred feasts. Merchants sold amulets and offering bowls beneath awnings that fluttered in the constant desert breeze, while scribes recorded donations and prayers on clay tablets that would be stored in the temple archives for eternity. The ascending ramps that spiraled around the ziggurat's exterior created a ritual pathway for processions that could stretch for hours, with priests and priestesses moving in stately formation, their robes rustling like whispered prayers in the morning air. Each step upward required greater purification, greater preparation of the spirit, as the procession moved from the realm of ordinary human concerns toward the threshold of divine presence. Musicians accompanied these ascents with instruments that seemed to capture the very music of the spheres, lyres whose strings vibrated with celestial harmonies, drums that echoed the heartbeat of the earth itself, and flutes that carried melodies as ancient as the stars. At the summit of each ziggurat stood the temple proper, a chamber so sacred that only the highest priests were permitted to enter its hallowed interior. Here, in rooms lined with lapis lazuli and gold leaf, the cult statue of the deity resided in magnificent isolation, surrounded by treasures that reflected the god's power and benevolence. These statues, carved from precious stones and draped in fabrics woven with threads of silver and gold, were not mere representations, but actual dwelling places for divine spirits, animated by rituals so complex and sacred that their full details remain shrouded in mystery even today. The Temple of Marduk in Babylon, known as the Esagila, represented the pinnacle of this architectural devotion, its walls rising in perfect alignment with the cardinal directions, and its chambers arranged according to cosmological principles that reflected the order of heaven itself. Within its walls, the creation epic was recited during the New Year festival, the words echoing through chambers designed to amplify and purify sound until the very air seemed to vibrate with divine presence. The temple complex extended far beyond the ziggurat itself, encompassing workshops where sacred vessels were crafted, schools where scribes learned the mysteries of cuneiform writing, and gardens where plants sacred to various deities grew in carefully tended plots. These sacred precincts operated as cities within cities, self-contained worlds where the boundary between human and divine activity dissolved into a seamless whole. Priests who served within these walls lived lives governed entirely by ritual calendar, their days beginning before dawn with purification ceremonies and continuing through sunset with offerings, prayers, and the careful tending of divine images that required feeding, clothing, and entertainment, as though they were living beings of infinite importance and sensitivity. The architectural symbolism extended to every detail of construction and decoration, with doorways aligned to capture the first rays of dawn during specific festivals, and chambers positioned to frame particular constellations during their annual appearances. Walls bore reliefs that told the stories of divine intervention in human affairs, carved with such skill that they seemed to move in the flickering light of oil lamps. bringing ancient myths to vivid life for all who gazed upon them with proper reverence and understanding. During the great festivals that marked the turning of seasons and the celebration of divine victories, these temple complexes transformed into theatres of cosmic drama, where the eternal struggles between order and chaos, light and darkness, civilization and wilderness were reenacted with pageantry that engaged all the senses. The sound of bronze trumpets echoed from the ziggurats' heights, while the smoke of countless offerings rose in columns that seemed to form a bridge between earth and sky, carrying human hopes and fears upward to the divine realm where all fates were ultimately decided. The economic power of these temples rivaled that of kings and merchants, with vast estates extending across the countryside, managed by administrators who answered directly to the high priests and ultimately to the gods themselves. Grain stores and treasure chambers within the temple complexes held reserves that could sustain entire populations during times of famine or war, making these sacred buildings not merely centers of worship, but pillars of social stability that anchored entire civilizations in an uncertain world. As night fell across the Mesopotamian landscape, the ziggurats remained illuminated by fires that burned eternally in their highest chambers, serving as beacons that could be seen for miles across the darkened plains. These lights represented the unwavering presence of the gods among their people, constant reminders that divine protection and divine judgment watched over every human action with eyes that never closed, and wisdom that encompassed all the complexities of mortal existence in a single perfect understanding. These towering ziggurats, with their stepped faces climbing toward the heavens, served as more than mere monuments to divine power. Within their sacred chambers, and at their shadowed bases, a complex hierarchy of priests and priestesses conducted the daily rituals that maintained the delicate balance between the earthly realm and the domain of the gods. The morning light would filter through narrow windows carved into thick mud brick walls, illuminating spaces where incense burned perpetually, sending fragrant smoke spiraling upward like prayers made visible. Here, in these hallowed spaces, the ancient arts of divination and magical practice flourished under the careful guidance of those who had dedicated their lives to serving as intermediaries between humanity and the divine. The priestly class of ancient Mesopotamia formed an intricate network of spiritual specialists, each with their own particular domain of expertise. At the apex stood the or Entu, high priests and priestesses who embodied the very essence of their patron deities. These exalted figures often claimed direct divine parentage or special blessing, and their every movement was considered sacred, their words carrying the weight of divine pronouncement. Below them, the Sangu priests managed the daily operations of the temples, ensuring that offerings flowed steadily to the gods, and that the complex calendar of festivals and ceremonies unfolded with perfect precision. The Kadishtu, sacred prostitutes whose union with worshippers was believed to mirror the cosmic marriage between earth and sky, occupied their own revered position within this hierarchy, their bodies serving as vessels for divine blessing and fertility. The morning rituals began before dawn, when the first pale light touched the horizon. In the innermost sanctum of each temple, priests would approach the statue of their deity with elaborate ceremony, beginning the awakening ritual that acknowledged the god's return to consciousness after the night's slumber. Sacred water, drawn from the temple's own well or brought from the life-giving rivers, would be used to wash the divine image's face and hands, while specially prepared foods and drink were presented as the deity's breakfast. The priests moved with deliberate, practiced motions, their voices rising and falling in ancient chants, whose origins stretched back through generations of oral tradition. These were not mere symbolic gestures, but essential acts that maintained the cosmic order, ensuring that the gods remained properly honored and therefore favorably disposed toward their mortal subjects. Divination formed the cornerstone of Mesopotamian spiritual practice, a complex system of reading divine will through careful observation of omens and signs. The Baru, liver diviners, possessed perhaps the most prestigious and feared skills among all the priestly specialists. These master interpreters would examine the livers of sacrificed animals, reading in the organ's surface markings, color variations, and structural abnormalities the gods' intentions regarding future events. Each fold and discoloration carried meaning, part of an elaborate symbolic language that required years of study to master. The examination took place in sacred chambers lit only by oil lamps, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows across the diviner's concentrated face as he turned the liver slowly in his hands. Comparing its features to detailed clay models that preserved the traditional interpretations passed down through centuries. The Ashipu, exorcist priests, commanded a different but equally essential realm of magical practice. These specialists understood that the world teemed with unseen forces, demons and evil spirits that could invade human bodies and bring disease, madness, or misfortune. Their knowledge encompassed hundreds of incantations, each precisely calibrated to address specific spiritual ailments. The exorcist would begin by diagnosing the nature of the supernatural intrusion, observing symptoms, and listening to the afflicted person's account of recent dreams or unusual experiences. Then, surrounded by carefully arranged ritual implements, bronze bowls filled with sacred water, carved amulets, bundles of specific herbs chosen for their protective properties, the Ashipu would begin the lengthy process of spiritual cleansing. The incantations flowed in rhythmic cadences, ancient words in Sumerian often followed by Akkadian translations, layer upon layer of meaning woven together to create an irresistible force against the invading evil. Dreams held special significance in this intricate web of divine communication, and the Shailu, dream interpreters, occupied a crucial position within the temple hierarchy. These specialists maintained extensive libraries of dream omens, written on cuneiform tablets that catalogued thousands of possible dream scenarios and their corresponding interpretations. The dreamer would come to the temple in the early morning, while the night's visions remained fresh and vivid, and describe their experience in careful detail. The interpreter would listen intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about colors seen, animals encountered, or the emotional tenor of the dream experience. Each element possessed multiple layers of meaning that could shift depending on the dreamer's social status, recent activities, or the current season. A dream of flying might herald promotion to high office for a government official, but warn of dangerous overreaching for a common merchant. The magical practices extended far beyond the temple walls into the daily lives of ordinary citizens through the work of the Ashipu and other ritual specialists. Protective charms and amulets were crafted according to precise specifications, often incorporating materials believed to carry inherent magical properties. Silver, associated with the moon god Sin, provided protection during nighttime travels, while iron, a relatively rare and precious metal, could ward off the most powerful demons. These talismans were often inscribed with brief incantations in minute cuneiform script, the very act of writing considered a form of magic that bound the protective words permanently to the object. The creation of such items required not only technical skill, but also ritual purity on the part of the craftsman, who would often fast and undergo purification ceremonies before beginning work. The Kalu, lamentation priests, served a unique and essential function within the religious landscape, their mournful songs and ritual weeping believed to appease divine anger and avert catastrophe. These specialists would gather during times of crisis, drought, plague, military defeat, to perform elaborate ceremonies of collective mourning. Their voices, trained to project both power and pathos, would rise in ancient laments that recounted the sufferings of the gods themselves, particularly Dumuzi's descent into the underworld and Inanna's grief at his loss. The Kalu often wore women's clothing during these performances, symbolically embodying the feminine principle of mourning and regeneration. Their songs created a bridge between human suffering and divine compassion, transforming community tragedy into sacred drama that could move the hearts of even the most distant deities. Temple archives preserved the accumulated wisdom of these various priestly specializations in vast libraries of cuneiform tablets. These collections included not only the standard ritual texts and omen compilations, but also detailed records of specific divination sessions and their outcomes, allowing future generations to refine and expand upon inherited knowledge. Young priests would spend years copying and memorizing these texts, gradually absorbing the complex symbolic systems that governed their chosen specialization. The act of writing itself was considered sacred, each cuneiform sign carrying not only semantic meaning, but also intrinsic power. Scribes would often begin their work with brief prayers to Nabu, god of writing and wisdom, asking for divine guidance in accurately preserving the sacred knowledge entrusted to their care. The integration of all these various practices created a comprehensive system for understanding and influencing the unseen forces that shaped human existence. Whether reading the flight patterns of birds, interpreting the configuration of oil drops on water, or analyzing the entrails of sacrificial animals, the priestly specialists of Mesopotamia had developed sophisticated methods for accessing divine knowledge. Their work required not only technical expertise, but also profound spiritual sensitivity, the ability to perceive subtle patterns and connections that escaped ordinary awareness. These men and women served as humanity's ambassadors to the realm of the gods, translating divine will into practical guidance that could help individuals and communities navigate the complexities of mortal existence, while maintaining proper reverence for the cosmic order that sustained all life. The twilight of the old gods came not with thunder or earthquake, but with the slow, inevitable drift of time itself, like sand settling in the hourglass of millennia. As empires rose and fell across the fertile crescents and windswept plains of Mesopotamia, the ancient pantheon that had once commanded the devotion of countless generations began to fade into the shadows of memory. The great ziggurats, those magnificent stepped pyramids that had reached toward heaven like prayers made stone, stood silent against the changing skies, their chambers echoing with whispers of forgotten rituals. The cuneiform tablets that had once recorded the daily conversations between mortals and gods gathered dust in temple archives, their wedge-shaped characters becoming increasingly difficult for new generations to decipher. Marduk, the mighty king of the gods, who had slain Tiamat and shaped the world from her body, found his temples growing quiet as Persian, Greek, and Roman influences swept across the ancient lands. The priests who had once chanted his praises in the towering sanctuary of Babylon grew fewer with each passing season, their voices diminishing like echoes in an abandoned hall. Ishtar's festivals, once celebrated with wild abandon and sacred passion, became subdued affairs, then memories, then legends whispered by old women in marketplace corners. The goddess of love and war, who had descended into the underworld and returned triumphant, seemed herself to sink into the depths of forgotten time. Yet even as the active worship of these ancient deities waned, their stories had already begun their greatest journey, not through the physical world, but through the realm of human consciousness and cultural memory. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay tablets in the dim light of ancient scribal chambers, had transcended its original religious context to become something far more enduring. The tale of friendship, loss, and the search for immortality spoke to universal human experiences that needed no temple or priest to remain alive. Merchants carried copies along trade routes, scholars translated passages into new languages, and storytellers adapted its themes to fit the myths and legends of distant peoples. The wisdom literature of Mesopotamia, those contemplative reflections on justice, suffering, and the meaning of existence, found new homes in the philosophical traditions of Greece and Rome. The questions that had troubled the ancient Babylonian sage in Ludlul Bel Nemeki, pondering why the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper, would echo through the Book of Job and the dialogues of Plato. The practical wisdom of ancient Mesopotamian proverbs, those concise observations about human nature and proper conduct, filtered into the folk wisdom of many cultures, their origins forgotten, but their insights preserved like seeds carried by winds across vast distances. The magical traditions of Mesopotamia, too, underwent this strange transformation from active practice to cultural inheritance. The elaborate rituals that had once filled temple courtyards with incense smoke and sacred chanting evolved into the theoretical frameworks of medieval alchemy and astrology. The ancient art of divination, reading omens in the flight of birds, the patterns of oil on water, the arrangement of sheep's liver, provided the foundation for systems of fortune-telling that would persist for thousands of years. The 7-day week, that Mesopotamian innovation, based on the observation of celestial bodies, became so thoroughly integrated into human civilization that few would remember its ancient origins in the temples of Babylon. In the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, Christian and Islamic scholars labored over translations of ancient texts, preserving fragments of Mesopotamian mythology within their theological commentaries. The flood narrative that appeared in Gilgamesh found its way into the Hebrew Bible, where it was retold as the story of Noah. The concept of a divine council, where gods deliberated over the fate of mortals, influenced the angelic hierarchies of later religious traditions. The Mesopotamian underworld, with its 7 gates and its ruler who judged the dead, left traces in the infernal geographies described by Dante and other medieval poets. Archaeological expeditions of the 19th and 20th centuries would eventually uncover the buried cities of ancient Mesopotamia, bringing to light the massive libraries that had preserved these ancient stories through millennia of darkness. The tablets discovered in Nineveh and Babylon revealed not just the skeletal plots of these ancient tales, but their full emotional and spiritual complexity. Modern readers found themselves moved by the grief of Gilgamesh for his friend Enkidu, puzzled by the same questions about divine justice that had troubled ancient Mesopotamian sages, and fascinated by creation myths that seemed to echo in the deepest structures of human imagination. The legacy of Mesopotamian wisdom manifested not only in preserved texts and translated stories, but in the fundamental patterns of thought that had been established in those ancient cities. The concept of law as something written down and publicly available, rather than simply the whim of rulers, had its origins in the Code of Hammurabi and similar Mesopotamian legal documents. The idea of history as something that could be recorded and studied, rather than simply lived and forgotten, emerged from the chronicles that Mesopotamian scribes had maintained for centuries. The notion of education as a systematic process of transmitting knowledge from one generation to the next had been refined in the scribal schools where young Mesopotamians learned to read and write cuneiform. Perhaps most profoundly, the Mesopotamian approach to the fundamental questions of existence, the relationship between order and chaos, the meaning of suffering, the nature of heroism, the possibility of immortality, had established patterns of thinking that would resurface again and again throughout human history. The tension between civilization and wilderness that runs through Gilgamesh would reappear in countless later works. The questioning of divine justice that characterizes Mesopotamian wisdom literature would become a central theme in religious and philosophical traditions across the world. As the centuries passed and the ancient cities of Mesopotamia returned to dust beneath the shifting sands, the gods themselves seemed to undergo a final metamorphosis. No longer worshipped as active presences in the world, they became symbols and archetypes, representing eternal aspects of human experience. Gilgamesh transformed from a historical king into an eternal figure representing the human struggle against mortality. Ishtar became not merely a goddess of love and war, but a symbol of the feminine principle that encompasses both creation and destruction. Marduk evolved from a city deity into an archetype of the principle that brings order out of chaos. The great myths and epics that had once been recited in temple courtyards found new life in university classrooms and literary circles, where their psychological and symbolic dimensions were explored with the same reverence that ancient priests had once brought to their religious interpretations. The gods of Mesopotamia had achieved, in this transformation, a kind of immortality that their ancient worshippers could hardly have imagined. Not as beings to be placated and petitioned, but as permanent residents of the human imagination, carrying within their stories the deepest insights of one of humanity's earliest civilizations. In quiet libraries and peaceful studies around the world, scholars continue to piece together fragments of these ancient stories, translating cuneiform tablets with the same careful attention that Mesopotamian scribes once brought to their sacred tasks. The gods sleep now in their clay tablets, but their dreams continue to shape the human story, their ancient wisdom flowing like an underground river through the channels of culture and consciousness, nourishing new growth in ways both seen and unseen, eternal and ever.